Well, I think that when it comes to relationship in particular, it's a tricky thing because to a certain extent, all of us are living in a certain amount of insecurity. We can spin out about like late stage capitalism and all that stuff, but it's like even if your relationship is feeling really healthy and your home life is very stable, your financial well-being is very stable, that like we're still living in this situation that does not produce a sense of well-being. And so like I think that anger anxiety treadmill can still be very much active for pretty much everybody.
Welcome to the Multiamory podcast. I'm Jace.
I'm Emily.
And I'm Dedeker.
We believe in looking to the future of relationships, not maintaining the status quo of the past.
Whether you're monogamous, polyamorous, swinging, casually dating, or if you just do relationships differently, we see you and we're here for you.
Things I know I did, forcing me to form myself to fit.
On this episode of the Multiamory podcast, we're diving into the complex and often misunderstood connection between anger and anxiety and how it can impact your romantic relationships. So, if you've ever found yourself lashing out at your partner or being passive-aggressive when you're stressed out, or maybe shutting down emotionally when you're overwhelmed, you're not alone. Today, we're going to be exploring some of the science between why anger and anxiety often go hand in hand. We'll try to debunk some myths about what these emotions look like in relationships, and then talk about some tools and things that you can do to break free from the cycle of anxiety and anger, and some ways that by dealing with both, you actually might make better progress with each of them than you would dealing with them separately. So we're very excited to dive into this. If you out there are interested in learning about our fundamental communication tools that we reference on this show, you can check out our book, Multiamory: Essential Tools for Modern Relationships, which covers some of our most widely used communication tools for all types of relationships, some of which can be really helpful when dealing with anxiety and anger in your relationships and any kind of communication issues. You can find links to buy it at multiamory.com/book or wherever you buy books. Also, check out the first few episodes of the podcast if you haven't already for some of our most fundamental episodes that we reference often on this show. So welcome. Let's start this off. Dedeker, Emily, have you ever been angry?
Oh, every day.
Okay. Is it your secrets you're always angry? Is that
Yes, that is
Okay,
my secret.
good,
Well, what
good.
is it that they say that like if you're not angry, you're not paying attention?
Oh boy, I mean, that does seem to be more and more true every day.
I think you and I, Jace, we've had these conversations before talking about how for me, I think my anger tends to be much more accessible, and for you, your sadness tends to be much more acceptable, which falls in line with what was modeled for us in our
Mhm.
families of origin, of like, which emotions were acceptable within the house. What is it for you, Emily?
I feel like in my 20s and early 30s, anger was far less accessible for me, and sadness was definitely pretty accessible. And I feel like I've been angrier recently. I know that you commented on that, Jace, when we were doing my breakup episode. And yeah, I don't know if it's just that I have things that I'm angry about recently, or maybe I'm just accessing it now more readily than I once was able to. It's not my favorite thing, honestly. Like, I feel like my fuse is a little shorter these days.
Huh, interesting.
And I want to work on that for sure, because it's not particularly becoming. But it's also kind of nice sometimes to not just be sad, to instead be like, there are things that I should be angry about, and I am, and it's okay.
I think that's such a good point you bring up there. And this is something that I actually have had two different, maybe even three different like counselors or therapists tell me something to that effect of either saying, as we work on this, you might find yourself being more angry, and that's a good thing. You do want to have some of that anger so that you're not just directing everything inward towards yourself, right? That it is sometimes there's stuff to be angry about, and that's okay, assuming that you're expressing it in a way that's not being really destructive or whatever. I think there's that assumption there, but it's possible to have healthy anger. We talked about this way back in episode 205. But what's funny is that one of these, she was a counselor that I talked to. This would have been back in like 2008, maybe. And then more recently with my current therapist have also had conversations about anger. And so I think you bringing that up is a good thing to think about as well, that anger on its own isn't bad, right? Like having some feelings of it is part of the natural range of emotions to be feeling. But then in our relationships, anger can show up in these negative ways of like being snappy and snarky with a partner when it's not merited. I think there's a difference between, yeah, I feel some anger about some things that happened that make sense for me to be angry about versus I'm irritated that you're trying to help me. Like, why do you keep talking to me? Or I don't know. Those sorts of things that can happen when we're feeling really on edge and that can negatively affect our relationships.
Okay, but hold on, because in the intro, you're teasing this whole anger anxiety package duo combo.
Yeah, it's a package deal. It's a discount if you buy both.
Well,
Great.
so I wouldn't normally want to purchase them as a package deal.
Shoot.
I'll just go ahead and give you that feedback. But also, second of all, I don't associate those as a package deal. Honestly, I think of anxiety as being more shrinking and frenetic, and anger as maybe more expansive and often targeted.
I gotta say, though, when we were sort of looking at this episode before we started recording, I was thinking back to a relationship where my partner had a pretty stressful job where he was basically one of the heads of it. And I felt like a lot of the anxiety that he felt for that job would come out as anger in our relationship. And so when I heard you say that and talk about it, and when we kind of looked through what we're about to discuss on the episode, it really made a lot of sense to me in terms of my own personal understanding of kind of what was going on there. And it made me maybe have a little bit more, I guess, empathy for the situation. If this is something that's fairly common, that it will manifest in a way that is maybe potentially fairly destructive if the anxiety or if the anger is not dealt with in some way.
Right. So that was basically the way this episode came about, is that I realized it had been quite a while since episode 205 when we've really talked about anger. And I do think it's an emotion that doesn't get enough attention in terms of like how to deal with it in a healthy way, rather than just focusing on it as only a negative thing. But in researching it, I found that there's quite a few studies talking about this link between anger and anxiety. And I also, like you, Dedeker, hadn't really considered it before, but as I started looking into it, it did start to make sense. Like you were saying, Emily, where I was like, oh yeah, there is that. So to give you kind of a basic overview of it, one way that it goes is that anxiety can trigger anger as a defense mechanism. So if we're feeling anxious, that comes from, our body feeling threatened, and it's activating our fight or flight response. And that fight or flight, the fight part is anger, is a way to do that. And so this acting out in aggressive ways can be this way to try to regain control. And if you think about, if you've ever dealt with like an animal that's running away from you, like if you're chasing after a dog or something like that got away.
Or God forbid, a cat with claws.
I mean, cats actually probably a better example.
Much worse.
Yeah.
That they're going to run from you usually. But if you corner them, suddenly running's not an option anymore. And that's when the claws come out, right? That's where, I can't flight anymore, so now I'm going to fight. And I think that with us humans, all this stuff gets more complicated because of all our social dynamics and things. We're acting less like physically and instinctually a lot of the time. So if you imagine this where I'm feeling really anxious, which my body is interpreting as you're feeling threatened, and I'm trying to manage that, trying to figure out what to do, and then my partner comes to try and help me, but the way that they do that, kind of comes into my personal space, or I feel like is just complicating it. It increases that. And so then I might lash out and be like, get away, you're smothering me, or get angry that you're patronizing me, trying to help me, or things like that. I think that's where some of the anger when people use the wrong Triforce can come from. If someone gives you advice when you don't want it, especially if you're feeling emotional and anxious about the thing you're expressing, it can feel like, okay, now I need to attack back to protect myself and to keep some safety.
It's interesting also that anger and anxiety can share a lot of the same physiological symptoms. They can be really similar within your body. They both involve the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and then that leads to similar physical sensations like increased heart rate and rapid breathing and muscle tension. When you go to acting school, at least for me, they talked a lot about like complex emotions and how often, emotion isn't just like one thing. You're feeling multiple things at once. And it's interesting, I guess, when I look at this and think about, if you're angry, you can also feel that kind of underlying anxiety in there as well. And that sort of just can perpetually feed upon each other. So when we experience anger, these physical symptoms can be misinterpreted as signs of anxiety, and that can lead to a heightened sense of unease or panic or I got to get out of this situation. Like you can feel your heart racing when you're in the heat of an argument with a partner, and that kind of triggers anxiety maybe about the state of your relationship, for example, and maybe will make you think like, should I even be in this? Is this something that I really want to continue to be a part of?
And then that's where the cycle comes in, right? That each one can trigger the other. And so that's how this anger, anxiety connection comes about.
And also because it's essentially, it's the same instrument doing all the stuff, right? It's like still your sympathetic nervous system that's activating your heart rate, that's making your palms all sweaty, that's activating your breath rate, even though fleeing or fighting are two different modes. So it's like your body still needs to be prepped for some kind of action, whether it's escaping or whether it's fighting. And so you're still getting that same release of stress hormones triggered, like cortisol and adrenaline. And so that's why it's a lot of the same symptoms. It's just like it's the same chemical going into the pot, causing the same reaction. And just like we've covered in previous episodes about how chronic stress hormones being in your body can cause ongoing health issues or chronic health issues, it's the same thing here, whether it's anger or anxiety or this duo package combo of both of them. It can not only lead to long-term health issues, but also relationship strain.
Mm-hmm. I remember the first time this concept where the physical symptoms of emotions could be the same, and it's only kind of the meaning we put on it that changes how we act about it and how we feel about it. I remember first reading about this in a book on experimental psychology many, many years ago, and it kind of blew my mind at the time. And the example they used in that book was fear and infatuation. And actually some symptoms overlap with what we're looking at here, not quite the same, but that feeling of kind of butterflies in your stomach, maybe your palms are a little bit sweaty, there's a little bit of anxiety and excitement. And like Emily and I were in an acting class where we had a teacher who would talk about if you're feeling nervous about an audition, what if you thought about that nervousness as feeling excited? Because the physical symptoms are basically the same. And so it's kind of you putting a different meaning onto that. Now, I think that's easier said than done. But to go back to that experimental psychology book, there are some studies about having people see someone else that they might be attracted to after they had done something that elevated their heart rate. I think in this example, it was just like running on a treadmill for a little bit. And they found that compared to a control group, they rated that person more highly on like attractiveness and how much they were into that person.
Wow.
Because they were experiencing something they would experience with a lot of attraction, but for a different reason. It's like our brain and body doesn't quite know how to determine what the source of a physical thing is. Like we can try to, but that it's very easy for our emotions to get confused.
So if you have a crush on someone, is the idea like put them on a treadmill or suggest that you go jog together, and maybe that's going to help your chances that they're going to be into you?
The author of this book's suggestion was to take them to a scary movie on your first date. That's another option.
Well, I think that's a terrible first date idea. I'll just shoot that one down right out the gate. But yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's going for a walk together, actually. That's a nicer first date, I think, but get that heart rate elevated a little bit. So anyway, to bring this back to anger and anxiety, a couple studies to mention here. One was this one called A Systematic Review of Neural, Cognitive, and Clinical Studies of Anger and Aggression. This is from 2024 by Richard et al. And basically the key finding here was that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, so a part near the front of your brain, is a brain region that's involved in emotion regulation, that it activates in a very similar way for both anger control, so like when it's trying to suppress anger, and also when it's trying to modulate anxiety, when it's trying to deal with anxiety. So showing that also our system that tries to cope and regulate both of those activates in a very similar way to do that for both emotions. And then another one is a study by Smith et al., also from 2024, called The Relationship Between Anger and Anxiety. And basically this one just showed this strong correlation between the two emotions, kind of like we talked about, that anger can cause anxiety and anxiety can cause anger. And their key takeaway was about treatment and saying that if you try to treat just one in isolation, that may actually be less effective than treating both. So rather than, I guess, just going to some kind of anger management or relaxation thing or something about anxiety, that actually addressing both together could be more effective.
Now, when we look at things like anger and anxiety, there definitely are these kind of preconceived ideas of what both of those things kind of manifest as and look like. For example, anger always looks like maybe yelling or physical aggression, but in reality, it can manifest as passive aggressiveness or stonewalling or even sarcasm. And then anxiety, maybe people think that it always presents as kind of nervousness or worry. In reality, it can also appear as irritability or controlling behavior, trying to control a partner perhaps, or even perfectionism. Something near and dear to our hearts.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting to look at the controlling behavior piece there and to think about kind of that thing we've all heard of before and that we've probably all experienced to a certain degree of a partner who's very controlling and trying to really manage our life, to see that actually might be an expression of anxiety. And I think a lot of us wouldn't immediately make that connection between those. A couple more studies that I thought were interesting. One seems obvious, I guess, but it's nice to have that backed up by a study. This is called Anger and Anxiety in Intimate Relationships, a study of married couples. That's by Johnson et al. In 2023. And basically their finding was that high levels of anger and anxiety predicted lower relationship satisfaction and made those couples more likely to separate or get divorced. I think that seems obvious, but it is worth noting that there's statistical significance there too, that anxiety and anger in relationships makes them less happy. And then the other one, this one I did think was really interesting. This is called Anger and Anxiety in Older Adults, a Cross-Lagged Examination by Siegel Karpus in 2024. And it's a weird title, but basically what they mean by cross-lagged is doing a longitudinal study. So they took this sample of almost 7,000 older Americans, and then 4 years later surveyed that same sample of people again. And basically what they found is this cross-lagged effect. And that means that if in the initial survey, they reported higher levels of anger suppression, of like needing to withhold anger in their relationship, or that they expressed a lot of anger in their relationship, that then 4 years later, that person had higher amounts of anxiety that they self-reported. And similarly, if in the first study they reported higher levels of anxiety, in the second study, they would report higher levels of expressed anger and suppressed anger. So effectively, in both directions, they found an equal amount of correlation between one earlier causing more of the other one later on. So showing this balanced, cross-lagged reciprocity, I guess.
That's really interesting because I think that usually we associate someone who is suppressing their anger as someone who is not expressing it. And that if you're expressing it, you're definitely not suppressing it. But I think that this seems to imply that if people are feeling anger, that's not being dealt with in an appropriate way, whether that's through like unhealthy expression or suppression, it's like you're going to end up with the same result of this balance out of anxiety that comes along with it. And I mean, you're the one who actually looked at the text of the study, like were the same people reporting both anger suppression and expression, or were those like different groups of people that tended to report that?
What they said specifically was that they found that the amounts of both were increased for the expression and suppression, that both of those were increased, but it didn't clarify if, I mean, I could go back through all the numbers, I suppose, but they didn't seem to find a significant difference of like, if the person expressed more than they suppressed earlier on, if those like flipped, or if it was just the same. But basically the levels of each compared to the levels they were before would go up if they had been anxious at the first point in time, 4 years before the second point. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, it does. Yeah, I mean, I feel like my armchair theory about all of this, at least when it comes to the anger, is that even if you are suppressing the anger, like that's only so sustainable for so long. And
exactly.
I think we've talked about this before.
Eventually.
Yeah, that if you're angry or you're resentful at a partner and you think that you can just keep it under wraps or keep it to yourself, it's like you still find ways to express it.
It'll seep out.
You know, even if it's you know, I don't know, closing the dishwasher door and slamming it a little bit more than maybe you would, right? Or like kind of huffing around the house if your partner doesn't do something that you thought they were going to do. It's like you find ways for it to be expressed. And often it's just not in very healthy ways because you've been spending all your energy trying to suppress it.
Yeah, and I think that part of what I take away from this is that it's not a correlation between how you're expressing it or whether you're expressing it, but just are you feeling it? It's like, do you have that anger and resentment that leads to anxiety, or do you have anxiety that leads to that anger and resentment? Regardless of whether you're really good at suppressing it or not. To kind of be like, just because you think you have it under control doesn't mean that it's not still potentially going to have some negative effects. I think that's kind of the key takeaway there.
The two of you talked a little bit about your relationship to anger and how your family of origin may or may not have contributed to that. And I'm assuming it probably did. I think that it probably did in my own life as well. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if we're looking at things like insecure attachment styles with anxious or avoidant insecure attachment styles, that can definitely lead to coping mechanisms that maybe are maladaptive, that aren't great for us. Or if you have unresolved trauma or trust issues from previous relationships, whether those relationships are ones with your parents, family members, or past romantic relationships, they can really fuel current anger and anxiety. I think that, yeah, that has happened for me. Again, my shorter fuse is happening because I'm still processing a lot of what I went through in my last relationship, and that's causing me to maybe have more anger in my life and even in my current relationship to a degree.
And I think it's important to go along with what we were saying earlier about how these feelings do find a pathway eventually, a pathway out of you and onto something or someone else that, you know, sometimes even if you're like so good at keeping it under wraps, that often it means the only channel is to direct it towards yourself. So like self-directed anger and self-directed anxiety or shame can also influence your relationships with other people, right? You know, so if you're internalizing this anger, anxiety combo, it leads to that self-blame, maybe the feelings of unworthiness, maybe the inability to be able to let your guard down and relax, right? Like difficulty accessing things like self-compassion or self-acceptance, which also influences our ability to be compassionate and accepting of others that are around us. And I know that it makes me think of my experiences in relationships, especially times when I have, I think, been the most caught in that angry, anxious cycle, which was a lot of the pandemic. I think that was the case for a lot of people during the pandemic, that when I would lash out at a partner or be hypercritical of a partner, it was 100% a reflection of like how hypercritical I was of myself. You know, like, and the standard that I would hold a partner to was 100% this mirror of like the extremely high standard I was trying to hold myself to for certain things. So I don't know. I think I'm just trying to make this point that like there's no escaping your feelings is ultimately what I'm trying to say at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that we should be less critical of ourselves so that we can be less critical of our partners, perhaps, or that it all starts with us.
It all starts at home, you know? No,
Yeah.
I'm saying like we're all messed up and there's no avoiding it and there's
Oh,
no escaping
goodness.
it. It's a little bit more of
Sure.
a less hopeful message, I suppose.
Oh,
Boy,
okay.
oh boy. No, but I think it's worth acknowledging that they all feed into each other. And so to go back to what I had said before about the studies showing it's more effective if you try to treat both instead of just one or the other, that I think that's true with a lot of kind of wellness stuff, is that if we try to treat it in isolation, which I think is how the kind of traditional Western medicine way of approaching physical problems also goes that way. It tends to be like, let's try to treat as specifically this one thing as possible. And I think that's starting to change now, but realizing that there's a little more of a holistic approach because, yeah, maybe you can do this thing to fix your knee pain, but maybe it's actually something about tension in your low back that's changing how your hips move that's affecting your knee pain, right? That all that's kind of interconnected. And then by favoring that knee, you're now putting more weight on the other side, which is causing shoulder pain up on the opposite side. You know, it's like everything can be interconnected. And I think emotionally, we have a very similar thing, like this link between anger and anxiety. And something that I am realizing now, I should have looked to see if there were any studies about this, but I think the pandemic was a great example of increased anxiety levels for basically everybody. And at least anecdotally, from my experience, I also felt like I witnessed a lot more anger from people toward whoever else they felt like they could be angry at during the pandemic. And I think some of that's still holding on, although it feels less intense than it did back then. But that's an interesting kind of larger population version of exactly what we're talking about here.
Well, I think that when it comes to relationship in particular, it's a tricky thing because to a certain extent, all of us are living in a certain amount of insecurity. We can spin out about like late stage capitalism and all that stuff, but it's like even if your relationship is feeling really healthy and your home life is very stable, your financial well-being is very stable, that like we're still living in this situation that does not produce a sense of well-being. And so like I think that anger anxiety treadmill can still be very much active for pretty much everybody.
Mm-hmm. Certainly to a certain extent, yeah.
I think it can be really easy to get into relationships to try to fix or save ourselves from ourselves or kind of fill or change some of the past patterns that we've had in other relationships or maybe fix the things that are challenging about ourselves currently. And we just did an episode on, you know, your partner shouldn't fix your own insecurities, but they also shouldn't fix or save you from your own emotions. And things like emotional regulation, I think a lot of us want our partners to be the one to help us emotionally regulate. And while they can, and that is a thing that you can mutually do together, ultimately it is your responsibility and not, you know, solely your partner's job to do that. And expecting a partner to manage your emotions, it can lead to things like codependency and resentment. And I think a lot of us just expect our partners to be the ones to fix us. Even if we don't have that at the forefront of our mind, it's still in there and it's still something that kind of is underlying. And when they can't do that, because nobody can really do that, it has to come from within, that can lead to resentment. And that can just continue to perpetuate this shitty cycle that we're talking about today.
For sure. So I would say, I hope that all of us, as well as all of you listening, are convinced, yeah, okay, this is something worth addressing, something worth dealing with. So let's get into the part where we talk about how. What can we do? What can we actually do about this issue?
Probably the first and easiest thing to recommend, although not always easy to execute on, is seeking out some kind of individual counseling or joint counseling with your partner in order to develop, you know, healthier communication and coping skills if you suspect that this anger anxiety binary star is maybe undercutting some of what you want your relationship to actually be. And so you can take your pick of whatever therapeutic approach works for you. You know, we like to recommend emotionally focused therapy from Sue Johnson, especially for couples work. CBT is really good if you feel like for you, your angry, anxious cycle is caught up in like your thoughts and in your beliefs. Of course, I'm a huge advocate for somatic experiencing as well, because it tends to deal directly with what's going on in your nervous system, especially if you think that it may be related to prior trauma. But ultimately, the best type of therapy is going to be the type that resonates with you.
If you're noticing that a partner is coming at you with some anger or passive aggression, it might be a good idea to ask them, are you anxious about something? Or is something going on in your work life or in another area of your life that you're anxious about? I think that kind of opening the doorway to that anxiety side of things rather than the anger side of things is going to enable you to come at something with a little bit more empathy and softness and not as, I guess, intimidating and defensive as one might be if you're approaching someone who seems really angry or thinking, okay, what are they angry about? I also need to get angry back at them. I think coming in instead with that curiosity about what is causing them anxiety, that's a really great way in which to approach a challenging time within their life.
Maybe don't hit them with that immediately right when they get angry with you, but, a little bit later, come in and have that conversation, like during a radar check-in or something like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, anger also might just be a plea for like some space and control. So maybe just back off a little bit as well. That's always a good thing. Give them time to sort of simmer down a little bit and have a moment, halt, or establishing timeouts or cool down periods. All of that is a really great coping mechanism. If you create a shared relationship care plan with agreed upon strategies for managing anger and anxiety, especially if you notice that that's something that the two of you tend to kind of go to often, a pattern that you may get into often, then creating a relationship care plan, I think, is a really great way to go. Another great thing to look at is our episode on Repair Shop, or our chapter in our book, Multiamory Essential Tools for Modern Relationships. In that, it's basically a way in which to come back together after a fight or after a moment of conflict. You take a day or you take an hour, you take a little bit of time away from it, and then you come back and you look at the stories that were happening between each of you during that argument. You go back and discuss your histories, why maybe something was so heated, why you were getting really anxious or angry or emotional about something because maybe of past history that was challenging regarding that specific thing. You take ownership of your part within the argument that you may have had. And then prevention is the last step. And that sort of goes hand in hand with this relationship care plan. What are the things that you can do in the future to ensure that something like this may not happen again? And with that, I mean, that enables you to also share your fears and your insecurities and your needs, hopefully openly and honestly in a safe space. We have other things like Radar for that as well, so you can definitely go check out our tools. And it's great to always be able to respond to a partner's vulnerability with empathy and validation and understanding. I know that can be challenging sometimes, but come first from a place of, I want to help. I want to tackle this problem with you. It's not about you. It's about something that the two of us can address within the relationship and hopefully make better.
What you brought up a little bit earlier, Emily, about, if you're seeing anger, maybe addressing it as anxiety and trying to find out what kinds of fears might be underlying it or what sort of feeling out of control might be underneath it. Or I guess it could go the other way too, of if you're noticing that your partner is anxious or they're expressing some anxiety, to maybe examine a little bit of like, is there some anger? Is there stuff that maybe you could be angry about that you're not expressing? I do think that's worth just noting because, like you said, Emily, maybe for that person, it would feel less confronting to deal with the other emotion that's a little less obvious. And I don't know that that's always going to be the case, but it just gives you a different option of how to approach it. The same for yourself, right? If you find yourself feeling a lot of anger, maybe inspecting, is there some anxiety here, or vice versa? Could just be like, okay, if I know I have a problem with anxiety and I'm not thinking about anger as much, talking about anger and how I might be feeling that or suppressing that could feel easier, I guess, because that's less of the mountain. It's like, okay, that's accessible. And maybe that starts to give me some inroads into the rest of this. On the idea of self-care, I know I stress this one a lot, but things like making sure that you're getting enough sleep is really, really important. Sleep is incredibly important for our mental health. And if you're not getting enough of it, doing what you can to try to improve that. If, you're struggling with anxiety or difficulty sleeping, I definitely go through phases of that myself. I can relate to it, and you just got to do the best that you can. But if I'm not sleeping because I'm just staying up late or, partying a lot or playing games till late in the evening, you've got a lot of control over that. And it's worthwhile that you might not realize the degree to which that can affect your mental state, or even just your ability to examine your own thoughts and your own feelings are really compromised by not getting enough sleep. So that's really one to consider. Another is paying attention to what you're consuming. And this is something that if you find you consume a lot of news or a lot of social media, if people are posting a lot of stuff that makes you feel anxious, that's what sells, right? Like, I think that people talk about news really playing into fear. I think it's really anxiety more than fear. That's the thing that it's like, yeah, I'm worried and I'm scared, but I also not sure what's going to happen. So I've got to keep watching. That's what kind of gets us sucked in. And I think a lot of what people post on social media really plays into the same kind of thing. And that anxiety might be contributing to us feeling more angry. Or if you're watching a lot of what's going on in the news and in politics, you might feel really angry about it, and that's going to increase your anxiety. So being aware of that and trying to limit some of that consumption can really be important. And then the last couple here is related to drugs. So the first is trying an experiment of stopping drinking alcohol or having cannabis or caffeine, or at least, cutting them down. And the reason why I say experiment is it's not like, oh, I'm going to quit this forever, but maybe stop for a month and just see, do you notice anything changing? It's especially helpful if you journal while you do it. This was something my therapist recommended a little while ago, and it was actually surprisingly helpful, where it wasn't like this night and day difference, but over time I was like, oh yeah. And also I don't have stomach aches as often. It's like I noticed these other things that seem to all be contributing to it together. And then on the other side, it could be that in therapy, you may find that medication is an option to consider. If we're talking about anxiety or depression, which also can be connected to each other, actually having some medication on that, you might be surprised at how much it helps out with another area like anger or passive aggression or difficulty communicating in your relationship.
Of course, you can always seek support from friends or family or a therapist to avoid over-relying on a partner for emotional regulation. It's always important to build a diverse support system to meet various emotional needs. That's one of the great things about something like non-monogamy, but also just multiple friends, family members, community. We have a great community. You can also really encourage a partner to have their own support network and coping strategies. I think it's really difficult, and it's something that I've seen in past partnerships. Partners who don't have that, it's very difficult, I think, for them to be able to rely on anyone other than the person who is on the other side of the anger and anxiety for ways in which to fix the problem. And if you don't have a therapist, and if you don't really have a lot of friends that you talk about vulnerable things with, like, who else are you going to go to? So try to find that, because your partner can't be the only outlet for that. It's really not fair to them. And when you connect with your partner, or when you connect to other people, take ownership of the anger that you personally have. And I think it's easy often when we're talking to people to kind of vilify someone else other than ourselves, but it's also very important to be able to take ownership in any capacity for whatever part of the challenges that you're facing in your relationship.
I think that this is a difficult topic to give suggestions for because it can feel so big. We've done episodes entirely dedicated to anger, and we've done episodes entirely dedicated to anxiety, that these are standalone issues that we deal with and feelings that we deal with. But I think there's something about being aware of the link between the two of them that I'm hoping, rather than making it feel twice as overwhelming, makes it actually feel maybe twice as copable with.
Okay.
You know, like I hope that being aware of the link makes it so that you feel like, okay, because these two things are related, I can maybe like deal with both of them at once to a certain extent, since I know that they're a little bit of a package deal.
Not culpable, but copable.
Copable, not culpable.
Yes,
Copable.
copable.
with.
Okay.
Yes.
Culpable
One
with,
coping.
yes.
It rolls off the tongue. I know it's super easy to say. Just knowing that there's a relationship here means that you can look at the relationship instead of being so overwhelmed by, oh my God, I have to focus on my anger. Oh my God, I have to focus on my anxiety.
Yeah. Maybe it's a little bit like in a video game where there's the boss that's really difficult, but then you notice like they have a glowing tail that's their vulnerable point. That
Yeah.
maybe
Like
if, you know,
Ganondorf or Ganon, rather, at the end of Ocarina of Time.
Exactly.
Toads.
right. Or basically 10 billion other games, because that's such a common
Yeah.
mechanic for so long. But yeah, that idea of maybe this opens up for you an option of, oh yeah, maybe I could go for this part that feels more accessible or feels like I could make progress instead of this one that I've been running into and just don't know how to get through. And lastly, we want to remind you that you're not alone in navigating this complex world of anger and anxiety. Lots of people struggle with this themselves. I know all of us have gone through that at different points and still are in certain ways. And we do have a really awesome community in our Discord. There's some really amazing, supportive people. And if you start a thread talking about this, I bet you'll have a lot of other people who want to share their own experiences and help support each other. So you can go check that out on our Patreon. And we have a question of the week for you on our Instagram at multiamory_podcast. And that is, how do you and your partner navigate moments when one or both of you are feeling angry or anxious? And now this could be what are strategies that work well for you, or this could be what are the bad patterns that we fall into. Either way, I think it's helpful to share that and to think about that a little bit. Also, if you want to talk about this more, the best place to share your thoughts is with other listeners in the episode discussion channel on our Discord server, or you can post in our private Facebook group, and you can get access to both of those and join our community by going to multiamory.com/join. In addition, you can share publicly on Instagram at multiamory_podcast. Multiamory is created and produced by Dedeker Winston, Emily Matlack, and me, Jace Lindgren. Our production assistants are Rachel Chenoweth and Carson Collins. Our theme song is Forms I Know I Did by Josh and Anand from the Fractal Cave EP. The full transcript is available on this episode's page on multiamory.com.